Well, hello and welcome to the Boston Food Bank's first Focus Series event. I'm Cynthia McFadden, the Senior Investigative and Legal Correspondent at NBC News, and I'm truly delighted to be here with you. You know, while we're not all in the same physical space, I bet we're all united in our hope to understand better the crisis of hunger in America and to look for creative and long-lasting solutions. You know, there is no vaccine for hunger, but there are solutions, and we're here with two women who can really provide some important insights. You know, a personal word, I've been covering hunger issues for an awfully long time. In fact, just before Christmas, I had the opportunity to visit the Greater Boston Food Bank as part of a story that we were doing on the horrible increase in Norfolk County, Massachusetts in child hunger, the largest increase of any county in the country, 163%. So, to our agenda for today. We're going to begin with remarks from Claire Babineaux-Fontenot, who is the CEO of Feeding America. As you probably know, it's the largest domestic hunger relief organization in the country, and she leads it very ably. Then we're going to hear from the president and the CEO of the Greater Boston Food Bank, Catherine D'Amato, and we're going to explore what each of their organizations have seen over the past year, an update on what things look like on the ground right now, as well as look into the future. What do they think is going to happen next, and how can they be best positioned to try to deal with that reality? Now, just a note about this event. As you all know, this is streaming live on the Facebook channel of the Greater Boston Food Bank. It's going to be posted later in the day, so that if you like what you hear here and want to share it with friends and family, all you have to do is send that link around, and we'd encourage you to do that if what you hear you think is valuable. So we begin. Claire Babineaux-Fontenot brings a remarkable background to her work as the head of Feeding America. According to Forbes, Feeding America is the second largest charity in the country. You're going to hear from her in just a moment, but let me just start by saying what Feeding America does is remarkable. Working with food banks and food pantries around the country, they provide billions of meals every year to tens of thousands of people, and I frankly don't know where we'd be without them. Claire, it is really great to be with you today. And just a note, I want to say over the weekend, Claire was one of 10 individuals that NBC News selected as Inspiring America. So you certainly have inspired me, and I'm sure you're going to inspire our guests today. I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you not only for participating in today's event, but for your long-standing support of vulnerable communities across the country and, in fact, across the world. I think the only right way for me to begin my comments is with a thank you to this remarkable audience. One of the great privileges that I have in my role is to be on the ground and witness the impact that people like all of you are making, certainly in your community, but beyond your community, you have reach as well. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that reach in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Let me talk for a few minutes about the Feeding America Network. We are 200 member food banks, and we're so proud that Greater Boston Food Bank is among those 200. Over 60,000 agency partners, other nonprofits, everything from rather large organizations and partners to church basements and pantries who don't even realize that the food that they're providing to their communities often comes from inside of our network. We also have over 2 million volunteers across the country. And we have members of our boards of directors, we have donors, and we have so many friends and advocates. And we've needed all of you, especially over the course of the last several months. One of the things that distinguishes the work that we all do together is how fundamental nutrition is. I've in fact talked about the fact that everything good that happens for a human being starts with a foundation in nutrition. The reality is that there are tens of millions of people across the country who do not have consistent, predictable access to enough nutritious food upon which to build a healthy lifestyle. That's what we do. We help to ensure that no family in this country has to struggle with the question of how it is they're going to make certain that their children have enough to eat. That's what you do with us. And that's why I'm so deeply thankful. There are a lot of people who are struggling. And when Cynthia spoke earlier, she talked about the people that we serve, and she talked about how many meals we provided before the pandemic. I'd like to actually step back to right before the pandemic and what was happening on the ground. As of 2019, about 35 million people in this country were food insecure, according to the USDA. Of that 35 million, 10 million were children. All of us would agree that that's 35 million too many. Unfortunately, as a result of the pandemic, that number has been soaring. In 2020, it's difficult to quantify how many people have been turning to us for help. Tens of millions of people have. Right at the height, the peak of the need and the demand, our estimates were as many as 55 million people might be food insecure. Unfortunately, it appears that now about 42 million people are food insecure in the country as of now in this year. So who are these people who are turning to us for help? Some have for a long time struggled under the weight of generational poverty and generational food insecurity. But about 40% of the people who are turning to us for help during this pandemic are people who never before relied upon the charitable food system. We've experienced overall an average of about 55% increase in need. And I don't have to remind this audience of the headwinds that we had in front of us as we've tried to provide for people who are turning to us for help in such record numbers. There were shortfalls, there was breaks in the system. One of the primary sources for donated food inside of our network has been retail donations. And surely you remember the way that I do, those empty shelves at retail stores. Well, if the stores don't have anything to sell, they certainly have nothing left to give. I'm so proud of the work that's been done by our network, because in spite of all of those headwinds, we went from providing about 4.2 billion meals to tens of millions of people to last fiscal year, fiscal 2020, even with all of those headwinds. As a network, we provided 6.1 billion meals. And this year, when the crisis has certainly not been averted, our forecast is that we will be able to provide 6.5 billion meals to people in need. That doesn't happen without people like you. So again, I'm so excited and honored to have the opportunity to be a part of this conversation today. And if you hear nothing else from me, I want you to know that the people of this nation, the people of your community, your neighbors next door, we are all in your debt for your remarkable generosity. And unfortunately, it's likely that the need will continue for a while. We hope that you will continue to be our partners as long as the need persists. Thank you.
Claire, thank you so much for that. I mean, 6.1 billion meals, it's hard to even put your mind around that number. I have so many questions for you, but first let me invite into this conversation actually our host today, the remarkable Catherine D'Amato, who is the Greater Boston Food Bank's president and CEO. Catherine has been working in hunger relief for 40 years. Having spent some time with her, I can tell you she is a fearless advocate. Catherine, thank you for bringing us together. And now let's talk. Let me start in Boston, actually. 6.1 billion meals nationally. What's been happening in Boston? How many meals did you all deliver in this past rough year?
Sure. First, thank you, Cynthia and Claire. It's so great to see you and be part of the partnership with you and the Feeding America Network. Boston is not immune to what's been going on in the country. And in the last year, we've seen well over 86 million meals. And in such, the rise in food insecurity has been dramatic, historic, unprecedented. All these words have been used across the country, and indeed, it's true.
So Claire, what did you learn from this past year in doing this important but hard work? What did you learn you didn't know before the pandemic?
You know, I had a surmise, but it was proved by the pandemic. So I had a sense. I only came into this role in October of 2018. Not long after joining, I had the opportunity to visit Boston, to visit Catherine and her team. And I knew that we had highly capable, dedicated professionals working in the network. I knew the work that's done in the middle of crises, but we'd never seen anything like this. My surmise was that if any network was going to find a way to help, this was a network that would. And boy, was I proved right. This organization turned on a dime, Cynthia. The whole apparatus through which we normally delivered food changed because of health concerns for ourselves, for members of the community. Catherine and her team have engaged in such innovation. I'm confident we'll get a chance to talk about some of the things that they're doing. They've done some foundational work before this, but this crisis makes me even more proud to be affiliated with the likes of people like Catherine and the team.
Listen, having had a chance to go to the warehouse, Catherine, I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, you guys were well positioned, but the pivot was significant. Tell us a little bit about how that pivot happened, what you all did.
Yeah, it was enormous. I mean, talk about Mount Everest. I think that as across the country, when you're called upon, this is our work, this is our moment to be there for people in the ways that we'd been doing for years, but to increase the volume and to rise to the occasion. So the resiliency is what we saw across Eastern Massachusetts, across our partner agencies. Our team rose. And what has been amazing is to see the perseverance. They have continued to stay at that pace. And we've tried our best to offer as many resources as possible to them so that they can take a rest, so they can come back in, because it is not retreating. And what we've learned is that while this has been an enormous request from all of us to rise, that our community, donors, as Claire has noted, the generosity across the country and human stories is amazing, but the resiliency, the fact that we could, that we did, and that we continue is just enormously impressive to see the commitment to mission and to ensure that people get the food that they need.
Was there a single biggest issue? I mean, getting the trucks, getting the food. Was there a single biggest challenge to overcome?
Well, I think the fact that we had to all shift, what business as usual was not the case. And for those that have done disaster work across the country, they understand you're in the moment. You're trying to get through the next hour, the next few hours, to the next day. And that's where we all learned how to. So logistics, yes, enormous. The challenge of not being able to be with people, the social distance, the masking, all the new protocols and fear that was surrounding anyone's ability to acquire food, distribute food, access the food that they needed. We all had to learn and to adjust and to do that quickly. So the logistical piece was one that we had not seen before, changing models to grab and go models, as people have seen in stories across the country when it first started, long lines of cars, trucks, distribution coming into people's trunks versus having them come in. So we'd never really seen the safety in the distribution and having to pivot and change. And that's where the resiliency, the food continued to be distributed. The access points continue to be available. And I think, as Claire noted, when you can charge that whole system across the country to rise, it did. And that's impressive.
You know, Catherine, when I visited with you in December, you said that after 40 years working in this area, this had been the hardest. And you've been through plenty of natural disasters and other kinds of issues. 2008 was a rough year because of the economy, but this was the toughest. So I want to turn the conversation to Claire for a moment, because Claire, you're a relative newcomer in this area. Your background is so interesting. I love the fact that your parents raised over 100 kids, obviously community service in your gene pool here. But you were a big time lawyer. You were a tax lawyer. How did you come to do this?
Wow. You know, I often actually think about it in exactly the reverse. And I ask myself, why did it take me so long? So as you're saying, I am a tax lawyer by training. I had remarkable opportunities to do things that so many other members of my family did not have the opportunity to do. And I kept saying yes to opportunities. So I became a tax lawyer. So first off, my parents didn't have the privilege of graduating from high school. And I had the chance to do that and to go to college and then to go to law school and then to befuddle my mother by going to law school again to get an LLM. And she asked one of my sisters, what was wrong with the first law degree was her question. But I had that, I kept on getting these opportunities. And I've said that I think I've always had a head for math, but a heart for people. And fast forward, I'm on the fast track. I'm at Walmart. I'm at Fortune 1. I'm executive vice president of finance and treasurer. And I had a significant life event. And I'm going to try to get through it quickly so I don't cry. But I learned that I had cancer and everything changed. And I knew that I needed to find a way to act on things that I've known my whole life. That family that you speak of with over 100 siblings, 107 siblings to be exact, was a family in which I've known my whole life. That you don't need to look to distant shores to find hunger, that hunger is right here in this country. I've always known it. I became a lawyer because I had an aspiration to help people like my brothers and sisters. I saw the restorative power of nutrition on not only their bodies, but their spirits. I saw what could happen when people believed in you and invested in you. And I went about this journey of saying yes to these opportunities and finally had an opportunity to reflect and ask, so what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And my answer is, I want to do this.
Well, what a story. And so important. I mean, you have so many tools you bring to your role now. You know, there are people who say that you both are doing work that the government should be doing. How do you feel about that? Let me ask you first, Catherine. Should the government, and if there are hungry people in America, isn't that the government's responsibility? Why does it fall on not-for-profits?
Well, I think it's all of our responsibility. So I do get how people say that. And I think that's what makes our system is one of the most unique public-private partnerships that exists in the United States, to be able to look at how government resources are utilized and maximized along with private philanthropy, generosity, the retail and food industry, along with volunteering, community engagement. It's one of the most unique models. But yes, I think everyone has a role in ending hunger. The key, like Claire's story, is you have to find your way. And for some folks, it can be write a check or donate some hours or do a community project or get involved in your corporation or your church or your synagogue or mosque. But these are the ways that we have to engage people, that we all have a responsibility to lift our communities and to ensure that all communities have access to food. So government has a responsibility, and I assure you public policy, local, state, and federal is a very important role that the individual food banks play in the country, as well as what Feeding America drives to make sure we access every resource. You know, my grandfather used to say, as a farmer, we use every bit of the pig but the squeal. And I think using every bit of a resource that we can find, government, private, public, we need to all be in this together.
So we know that hunger does not affect every community equally or every segment of our population equally. The government did step up and increase the SNAP, what used to be known as food stamp benefits, by 15%, and they've extended that until the fall. But Claire, if that increase goes away, and I know that that made a big difference for many of the people who you've been serving, but if that goes away in September, what do you see happening? Need will increase?
I see the need increasing, yes. And I want to go back to the question that you asked earlier to Catherine and agree with Catherine's response and maybe say I believe that this is a yes and. That too often we try to make things binary that aren't. So there are needs, immediate needs that should be addressed, and we're well positioned to address some of those immediate needs. And we as a society ought to be looking deeply at what are the underlying issues that give rise to 42 million people not having enough food on the table to support themselves and their families. So it has to be an all-in fight, and it's one of those unique opportunities we have as a society to find something that's a 100% issue. This should be a 100% issue. There's a role for us to play. There's a role for government to play. There's a role for governments to play, and for corporations to play as well. So I definitely wanted to speak to that. The reality is that. Oh, please go ahead.
No. You finish up. Yeah. The reality.
Oh, I was going to talk about realities around disparities. We sometimes. I heard someone say during this pandemic, and I've now quoted it more than once because I find it to be so true, that even when we're in the same storm, we are seldom all in the same boats. And that's definitely true of food insecurity. There are some people in this country who are inordinately struggling. And as part of our work, we are committed as a network, and Catherine and her team, they've been working on some of these root causes for a long time. They understand that there are health outcomes that are far more severe for people who are food insecure. We have statistics that speak to the fact that if you're food insecure in this country, you're at least 2 times more likely to suffer with, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, so many comorbidities that made COVID more lethal. But that make your quality of life, you suffer needless suffering that happens in the country. So we are definitely committed to being a part of some of those solutions that are more comprehensive solutions for the people that we serve. Communities of color struggle so much under the weight of food insecurity. If you are African American in this country, you're 2.5 times more likely to be food insecure. If you're Latino or Latinx, you're 2 times more likely to be food insecure. If you are Indigenous or Native American, you're 3 times more likely to be food insecure. So I believe that what we will be judged upon as a society is, are we willing to look in the eye the realities of food insecurity, and then to step up together in unison to do something about those realities? I believe our network is ready to do that. I know Catherine and her team have already been doing that. We're hopeful that our whole society will make that decision together.
Yeah, and as you say, it's not just health outcomes. It's also, if you're a kid with an empty belly, it's real hard to learn at school. There are just so many ramifications for hunger in this country. And I must say, it is a little hard to understand why the wealthiest country in the world has so many hungry people. How do you keep from letting that fact get you down, Catherine?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, great question. You persevere, and I think that those of us in this work are deeply committed and, obviously passionate, but also want to see the end, where every family can walk into the grocery store and buy what they need. And so this issue of the pandemic has only highlighted what was already there, the inequities that were there, the issues around food justice, food equality, but the issues around racial inequality, economic inequality, education, all the issues of poverty, of which hunger is an outcome of, and that we have to persevere. And what's great right now, I think, is that the opportunity to work collaboratively, to work with so many other organizations and within communities where the intersectionality is highlighted and spoken, and the truth has been brought forward. Food insecurity is a matter of public health. If we can stabilize one's food source, have adequate, healthy access that is consistent, this is going to make a huge difference on individuals and families' abilities to rise and to be able to contribute positively for themselves and their families, and to also be able to be a part of communities and to make that difference. There's a deep commitment, and I think there's a deep opportunity. But you are right, Cynthia. If you get up every day and you look at those numbers, as we've just recently seen in Massachusetts and some of the forecasting that's happening, we're in this for a long time. But it's a fight worth fighting. And as Claire said, we need all Americans to make this a crucial issue.
Yeah, I know that you all just did the most recent. It was embargoed until yesterday. The latest look, a profile of what's going on in Massachusetts. Can you give us a couple highlights from that report, because it's sort of eye-popping to me.
It was eye-popping to us. I mean, we work very closely with Feeding America and with our state and looking at data and trying to understand what was happening during COVID and what has changed, how the landscape has changed dramatically for people in their lives. And so we did do a study that took place during COVID, where we talked to actual users and folks experiencing hunger in our state, and found a dramatic number of 1 in 3. Now, that is one of the worst numbers I've ever seen. And now this all has to do with how people are experiencing the period of time, where they're going, what were the barriers. We learned a lot about the issues of embarrassment and access and not being able to know where to go. And as Claire noted earlier, that the pandemic put so many more people in need of food, and so many more people to have to try to understand what is this system of emergency food whereby we can help them. The good news is that we did see half of those families with adults using the SNAP program. The bad news is we have so much more to go, and it's such a terrific program. And not unlike your question of government, this public-private partnership, one of us isn't the only answer. We all need to be the answer. We need SNAP, we need WIC, we need the emergency feeding system. We need all of that. More importantly, we need people to have good wages and fair housing and access to education. And food is it's the secret to all of that.
It's stunning when you look at the report how many people talk about shame. How many people are embarrassed, ashamed to ask for help? How do you fight that one?
Well, if you're asking me, you break it down and talk to them, and you try to understand how to eliminate those barriers, or to be able to understand how you might be able to do something different, and the listening into those communities. But, it is a shameful piece for people, and this is not new. This is just validated again, that if you're not able to provide for your family, or your embarrassment to ask for help from the government, or you don't want your neighbors to see you, or you don't want your children to know, there's so many aspects that require our care and concern for the individuals and families that are experiencing hunger. It is difficult to walk to a pantry, or to drive to a pantry, or to get to one and ask for help. It is extremely difficult. And recognizing that is part of how we can approach these emerging models to be in community and to build programs in new ways that are what the community wants in the way that works best for them. So I mean, and I know, Claire, that you've seen this across the country, and you've talked about it in since you've come to Feeding America about the pain and the embarrassment that families go through. And our job is to make it easier. Our job is to help them to know it's okay, and to ensure that that food is the healthiest as possible. So not surprising, Cynthia, that this came out in the study.
Yeah, and I'd like to add first, of course, I agree with the things that Catherine just said, and I believe that we have an opportunity, a real opportunity right inside of this crisis to address that challenge as well. There's this long-standing notion of earned hunger. That's a term that I use in this country. And it's rooted, I believe, largely in misunderstanding of what's really happening with families out there. So when people talk about the food stamp program as an example, now, as you said, SNAP, when I talk to people about the things that I've learned, sometimes they're surprised when you learn that I'm going to tell you the majority of people who receive SNAP benefits, okay, people with a household with someone living with disabilities, children, the elderly, and people with at least one job. That's not what we think of when we think of people who struggle under the weight of food insecurity, and we're wrong. So one of the things that I think is unique about this moment is I believe that we as a society would agree that people who are displaced from their jobs, when there's a shutdown and when they're told that business is now closed, you can't leave your house and go to that job, that surely we don't think that that group of people earned their hunger. If we can start with being empathetic and asking ourselves, what would we do if we actually suddenly, out of the blue, didn't have a job? Or if there was some significant financial challenge that we had, a medical challenge, for instance, that we had to try to overcome, that threw us for a loop, and we needed help. Could that happen to you? Could that happen to me? We have a lot of data out there that shows that the average American before COVID would have difficulty meeting a $400 cash emergency. So if that's true, we need to use that and extrapolate from that the issue is so often not the person, the issue is the circumstance that the person finds him or herself in, and that we have tools that we can use to help to address those circumstances and do it in a meaningful way. One of the data points that I like to talk about that gives me optimism too, by the way, Cynthia, and I'm highly optimistic about what we're going to do now, because I do think that empathy that was long missing is now more people feel empathy in this space. And I've seen people activate around that empathy. I've seen that outpouring of support. It's not hard for me to feel optimistic. I go around the corner, around the country, and go to food distributions where I know that those distributions would not happen without remarkable generosity across America. So I have lots of data that tells me that there are a lot of people who want to be helpful. But then I look at some other mismatches that say we can do something about this. Like before the pandemic, about 72 billion pounds of perfectly edible food, not counting household waste, was going to landfills. Okay. And 35 million people were facing food insecurity. That's a matching challenge. Let's take on that challenge. Feeding America's network is the largest food waste recovery organization in the United States. We can do it better. We can match that better. And when we do so, we can help so many of our neighbors. So there are solutions available to us if we have the raised awareness. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we had going into the crisis was that people simply did not understand what was happening with people across the country, often their neighbors, when it came to food insecurity. I was confident that if the American public understood the struggle, that the American people would stand up and help. And we are seeing that. Now we have to stick with it. We can't allow, when those lines are no longer on the streets or in parking lots and they go on the insides of buildings, we have to stick with people facing hunger, and we can get there.
Let them know. So Claire, this is Catherine. We seem to have lost Cynthia for a moment. So you and I are going to continue the conversation until we can get her back. So this is how we, keep things rolling. But I'm Greater Boston Food Bank is honored to be a part of Feeding America. We have been from the very beginning days. If you go back, I don't know how many years ago, to Phoenix, Arizona, when the original network was birthed. But it's really changed. And let's take a moment and maybe talk about some of the things you're seeing across the country about because of the pandemic, we've been maybe asked to look at things differently, to do things differently. And what are you seeing across the country? Here in Boston, we've invested a lot in emerging models. We're putting financial resources to help new models, whether they are, more healthy foods or greater access or ownership by communities. And so I'm just curious of what you've been seeing across the country, what our network is actually producing to help work with communities and come up with new ways.
Yes. So I want to talk about 2 points at least there, Catherine, unpack a little bit. So what you're talking about, you're doing in Boston, we're seeing play out across the country. And one of the benefits of being a part of a network is that you try things when they're wildly successful. Yeah. You can actually scale them across the country. There are many things that we do because of the example that the people on your team have provided, and we've been able to scale. So lots of innovation happening across the country. We talked just a few moments ago about the shame that comes along with food insecurity. We've actually been able to double down on this notion. It's called Order Ahead, and it's an e-pantry where it deals with the reality of the shame in the moment while we work on helping to remove that shame. But there are people who need help right now. So we're using technology to allow people to go into an online environment, to have the dignity of choice inside of that environment, to indicate what it is that their families need, and then to get access to the food that they need. So that's one of those types of innovations that I'm really excited about. But there are so many.
It's giving everybody the Instacart, right? It's making it's exactly. Equalizing that, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. And then another space that I would love to talk about, at least for a minute, is at the national level, we have received some remarkable gifts, and one of them was from McKinsey Scott. And we used all of the McKinsey Scott gift, $20 million, to fund a food security equity impact fund. And what we're going to be doing with that money is we're going to go into communities the way that you guys so often do in Greater Boston. We're going to model an approach that says that sometimes what people need who are struggling under the weight of food insecurity is for you to actually go to them and ask them what the solutions are. Right. So we're working to create larger tables and add chairs to partner with even more BIPOC-led and trusted organizations inside of communities to invite people with lived and living experience to the table and to come up with creative solutions that are curated for those communities, to test them, to learn from them, and then to the extent that we can to scale them across the country. I'm really excited about what that work is going to look like. And again, you've done this in Boston already on the health front, the big tables that you created to address food as medicine and to address the health implications of food insecurity. That's a beautiful model for having a table of co-equals in co-creative ideation. And we want to do that as we take on challenges around equity in food insecurity as well. So I'm very excited about where we're headed.
Those are great. The Instacart idea is clearly one that's bubbling up all over in terms of how to give that application and access. Again, it's my analogy of being able to walk through the front door. It's the equalizer, right? To be able to order what you need, culturally sensitive foods, access to things that are not. The challenge there is the geography, and then it gets us into broadband access, right? So it shows the inequity still in this country of having internet access to be able to do that, and or retailers who will be able to receive orders online and be able to do it. But you're talking about going into pantry systems, right, and ordering, and then being able to either do a curbside pickup or a delivery. I think in Boston, what we've seen here, obviously in our Hunger to Health collaboratory work and in the raising up the partnerships in ways that are unique. I know one of the things Cynthia would have asked us is, sort of, what do we see sort of in the future? And, for me, I would say that beyond our Mystic Community Market and our South Coast venture that we've invested in, these are investment funds, or these are truly impact funds, not unlike what you're doing with the resource of looking at health. Equity as it relates to racial equity is quite important. But we're also seeing how do we get our corporate partners to understand the importance of food insecurity, or put it the other way, the need for food security among their workforce. I want to see food security being the same question that a doctor asks me when I go for my annual: do I smoke? Do I drink? Do I wear my seatbelt? Everything okay at home? I would love also, is there enough food in the household, Catherine? Do you need any resources? I would love for HR departments to ask that same question of, do you have the resources you need among all these other pieces to round out what all Americans need? Are you seeing any of that across the network, where people are connecting the hunger to health issues, but also working with unusual partners?
Yes, I am. And we've been doing food insecurity screenings in partnership with some of our healthcare partners now for a while, and we've seen remarkable results as a consequence of doing that. I'm excited by some of those matchups. I remember in one particular case in Ohio where that's in fact being done. So there's the food insecurity screening, and then there's a relationship between the medical provider and the food bank, where the food bank comes to understand what is the recipe for success for that particular person who's struggling with food insecurity. And I won't soon forget having received a little medicine bottle, a small little medicine bottle, and it as being symbolic of the fact that food is actually the prescription and nutritious food is a prescription for so much of what people struggle with. So completely agree. And we're seeing that in lots of different places across the country among our members activating in that space. We are also seeing other innovations as well that give me quite a bit of hope about where we're headed as an organization. One of the things that we've often said, and you shared with me, I think when I came to Boston, what feels like a lifetime ago, is so often the food bank itself has the infrastructure that it needs to serve its community. But when you start getting into that 60,000 agency partner space, so many of those partners don't have access to refrigeration, and they don't have the infrastructure that's needed. Now, they're closer to the people in need of those services, but they don't have the infrastructure to even handle fresh produce. During COVID, we've actually increased our distribution of fresh produce and dairy by significant measure. And but we're going to have to double down on continuing to do that. That's going to require that we help and invest inside of some of those agency partners that we have across the country as well. So I'm excited by what's ahead. And I have a lot of optimism for what some of the innovations that we're seeing is going to mean for people facing hunger.
Yeah, I mean, these are great ideas, and I hope that our listeners, I want them to understand that there's a huge commitment in the network across the country. There clearly is in Boston. We've been a leader on this, on issues of nutrition and access to healthy foods, fruits and vegetables. I am still surprised, Claire, that sometimes I'll meet folks and they'll be like, "You give out fruits and vegetables?" And it's like, yes, we do. We give out millions and millions and millions of pounds of fruits and vegetables. And it's a very important piece. And hopefully our listeners know that there's a deep commitment and a growing commitment across the country to ensure that we give the access of protein, produce, and dairy, and also become more aware and sensitive to, again, the cultural foods and the choices, and how do we broaden those and put those into our system as well and access those. One of the things that I've seen in our system here in Boston is, we're purchasing a lot more food, and we've always been a purchaser of food, but Claire, I know you're probably seeing this across the country, where with COVID, it probably pushed a lot of our colleagues forward to purchase because, as you noted in your opening remarks, many of those donations shut down in the supply chain for a period of time. So we needed federal commodities, and then we were out competing and purchasing. In Boston, we're now purchasing well over 70% of our product in order to ensure its nutrient quality, but also and variety, but it is the way of the future. It's looking that way. Are you seeing food banks also having to use their capital and their donations to purchase more?
Absolutely have seen that. And without the generosity and support of donors, they wouldn't have been positioned to do that, right? But absolutely,
Correct.
We're seeing that happen across the country. Overall, nationally, we're seeing well over 3 times more food purchases on average than we saw before COVID. And some of the innovations that are happening, sometimes you can bring more than one thing together. I'll flag some work that's being done, for instance, in Minneapolis, in the Second Harvest Food Bank up there in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Everybody knows about the remarkable challenges that those communities are facing with the murder of Mr. Floyd and all of those implications. On top of that, there are people who are struggling with food insecurity there as well, and they're still finding ways to be resilient and to be innovative. So an example of what you're talking about, not only are they purchasing more food, not only are they purchasing more nutritionally dense food, but they're partnering with BIPOC farmers in order to get some of those culturally relative, nutritionally dense food out to the people that they serve. So when we work together, there's so many synergies that cut across so many different spheres inside of this work. And I'm excited that they say that necessity is the mother of invention. Well, COVID has presented lots of necessity, and the network has been remarkably innovative as a result.
To my colleagues and seeing a number of issues rising, and more importantly, as we begin in our system, not even began, but people have been doing this work, but to make sure that the health equity, equal access, understanding the challenges that for years communities of color have faced, and Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, people of color all over this country, as you well noted early on, these have been there. But the highlighted extent today. I mean, we're going to wrap it up here, but I want to ask you a question and then I'll close it up. And again, we're still missing Cynthia. If you can hear us, Cynthia, we love you, and we're missing you. So neither Claire or I are NBC correspondents and have the capability to do what you do so well, but we're doing our best, and I hope you're proud of us. But in any event, more than a month ago, about a couple of weeks ago, we had Dr. Anita McGann come and speak with us on as a global health economist to really look at the impact of COVID and food insecurity. And she really left us with three things to think about and to bucket what was happening in America and around the world, but to be aware of for the future. And she talked about how complex the issue is of food insecurity. And she talked about the volatility, that it isn't just going to end one day magically and we get up and we all go back, and that there will be these ups and downs. And where will the volatility occur, and how are we going to respond to it? And lastly, she talked about the consequences, which we've talked a little bit about today, the what occurs when an individual or family experiences relative to their health, to their mental state, to their housing, to their employment, to their ability to be with their families. It's just so enormous. So volatility, we're talking about volatility, complexity, and consequence. You have any words of wisdom from your role as we close up, how you would advise us to move forward, given we know those things to be true?
Well, because my time with you is about to come to a close, I want to answer your question. And I also have a few things that I want to make certain to share. So first, you talked about, and we kind of alluded to the notion that this is a marathon and not a sprint. Coming out of the economic downturn of 2008, it took 10 years to return to pre-recession rates of food insecurity. We had just gotten there at 37 million people in 2018. We had made additional progress to 35 million in 2019 going into COVID. I know that we can get to 35 in less than 5, and that we can't stop at 35 either. And I'm hopeful that we're going to do the things that need to be done in order to make that happen, which leads to your question. I know that the good doctor is absolutely correct, that what we're signing up for is not easy. It's hard. But I've never known of a country in history who have taken on harder challenges than we. When we decide as a nation that food insecurity here is simply unacceptable, that's the first most important thing. Let's decide food insecurity in the United States of America is unacceptable. Once we make that decision, I'm confident that we're going to take the steps that we need to, and we're going to stick with it as long as we do to make certain that becomes reality, because it's absolutely solvable. It's not easy, but it's solvable. And then the final thing I want to say in my last moment is thank you to you, Catherine. You are a titan in this work. I don't know if everyone who will see this video and will hear my voice will understand the remarkable impact, not only that you've made in the greater Boston area, but that wasn't your first food bank. You've been in this work for a very long time, and your reach goes far beyond which I could even quantify. So thank you to you. Thank you to your remarkable team at the Greater Boston Food Bank. It's my great honor that I get to serve with people like you, knowing what you're doing on the ground. I so appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for having me.